I think most of us recently have been shocked and frightened, but mostly perplexed by the fast-moving events of this election year. Columbia University, Chicago, Memphis and Los Angeles, Central High School in North Minneapolis, and now yesterday South High in South Minneapolis. Mark Rudd, Mayor Richard Daley, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and now the astonishing third-party candidacy of George C. Wallace, and as of yesterday, his running mate, General Curtis LeMay. All these swirl together in a collage of images that stagger the imagination. What's the meaning of it all, one asks? Where are the prophets to tell us where the whole thing is going? Perhaps this is not a time for clarity or prophecy, at least regarding specific problems. On the other hand, it may be a time for reflection on the general principles which lie at the foundation of our common life. For example, take Jesus' teaching on loving our enemies. Perhaps it might be good for us this morning to simply recount this teaching, which we all know so well, at least theoretically. Let me read from Matthew 5, verses 43 and following. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the just and on the unjust, and sends rain on the evil and on the good. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors the same? And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You must be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, what stands behind this business of loving one's enemies? Who is my enemy? Very simply, he is anyone who threatens me in some way. Someone who introduces an element of danger into my existence, who thrusts fear in my path. Well, why do we have to be told to love our enemies? We have to be told because it's not the natural thing to do. Love is an emotion and a commitment that we usually reserve for those close to us, not those far away. Of course, this tendency to hate one's enemies goes way back. It's apparent that primitive societies had neither the time nor the inclination to think of human beings outside of their group as equals with themselves. Quite to the contrary. They consistently count outsiders as their inferiors, even as lacking something in being. Primitive religions consistently call upon God to help them, assuming that they are not on the side of the enemies. Primitive laws and social structures hold good within the group, but do not apply for relations with people outside of the group. For example, there might be a law against murder within the group, but this is suspended when an enemy is encountered. And then the whole matter of emotion. The emotion of fear is allowed full sway when one approaches an enemy, and rarely the emotions of sympathy and compassion. Now, we may live in a very modern and enlightened age, but some recent events would seem to suggest that we are not yet quite out of the Stone Age. Take the following. On almost every newscast for the past few years, we've been mercilessly bombarded with the reports of how many of the enemy have been freshly killed by our troops in Vietnam. Or one of these boys comes home to receive the Medal of Honor, and we congratulate him for his bravery and for killing so many of the enemy. Bands play rousing military marches. The flags wave. The president gives an impassioned speech. And everywhere there's a smiling sea of faces exuding adulation and respect. Obviously, our civil laws against intentionally murdering another human being have been temporarily suspended. We don't expect these poor chaps to feel guilty. They're our heroes. They have killed our enemies. Or take the Chicago demonstrations. Many Americans, and some very close to me, evidently looked on with a kind of primitive satisfaction and relief as Mayor Daley's police force beat bloody the Yippies, the New Left agitators, and Senator McCarthy's student demonstrators. This group of people, which very obviously has become the enemy of affluent middle-class America. Now, apparently it didn't bother these viewers that Daley's mercenaries were breaking the law. Because, you see, where enemies of the people are concerned, there is no such thing as law. Or take the Humphrey rally last Sunday. Here the shoe was on the other foot. Hecklers were disrupting the meeting with shouts that they had come to place the vice president under citizen's arrest. Humphrey tried to plead for more reason on their part, but to no effect. They had to be ejected bodily. Now, these young people had not come to abide by the rules of the assembly, which might have granted a little bit of dialogue to them. Because Humphrey and the whole Johnson administration, as far as they are concerned, are enemies. And where enemies are concerned, you don't have to abide by laws, even if it's the law of common human decency. So obviously, it's still a very popular thing to do, to hate one's enemies. Why, to reverse this would be just as radical today as it was in Jesus' time. Imagine, you would be going against human nature. You'd be trying to reverse the whole tide of human history. But isn't this precisely what Jesus intended? Didn't he preach a new universal kind of justice, a new law which can never be suspended? Didn't he, in fact, propose that we do away with this whole notion of friends and enemies and to replace it with one category only, and that's brothers? Didn't he say that we are to count those outside of our group as equal with ourselves? Didn't he say that we are always to act morally even in relation to those who threaten us? And didn't he say, above all, that God is to be conceived by us as the friend and judge of all the nations, even our own? Now, here immediately someone is going to raise an objection. Isn't this naive and unrealistic? Isn't the nature of our world such that aggression must be met with force of arms and anarchy with police force? Can we realistically expect people not to respond violently when their security and integrity is attacked? Now, this objection has a point, but I don't think it's decisive. Because to love your enemy, I believe, is not necessarily to like him all the time. Skirmishes might take place, perhaps even some fierce battles, but the important thing is that it would be a battle among brothers, inside the family, so to speak. Take, for example, the following. What if the newscasters were to report in the following way? Today, 100 of our brethren from North Vietnam and among the Viet Cong had to be killed. Why, if that were to happen, our soldiers would return with wounds much more serious than a blown-off arm or shrapnel in the skull. Their consciences would be sick unto death. And they would demand, instead of brass bands, requiem masses and an opportunity to atone for their sins. And I would suspect that their guilt would be passed on to all of us and would infect us and make us sick. Police, too, might begin using their nightsticks with more reluctance if they realized that they were hitting brothers. And even the student protesters might act differently. They might be just as vociferous and unruly as before, but at least Humphrey and the Johnson administration would be looked upon as fellow human beings and not as some sort of incarnation of Beelzebub. Imagine what a difference it would make then if in all of our personal relations we look upon even those who threaten us, whom we do not like, as brothers rather than enemies. You see, when you call someone a brother, you establish something transcendent binding you together. It's no longer possible for your conscience to go on a holiday. And the natural emotions of empathy, sympathy, and compassion that we feel would be allowed to play even over against some who might be threatening our security. So again, I repeat, this may not be a time for clarity and prophecy with respect to particular problems. But I think we can certainly profit from hearing again these fundamental words of Jesus. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and his sends rain on the just and on the unjust.